And she said, from one day to the next, I went out on the street and my friends from school started pointing at me and saying, Jew, Jew, to the Nazis, the Nazi troops who were walking on the street.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, I didn't understand it. How could it be she was my friend a day ago and now she's basically condemning me to death?
This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 160 for the 6th of July, 2023. Sometimes it helps to draw a parallel between two events in the news. But two big recent stories, in Ireland, the scandal of RTE lying about Ryan Tubridy's salary, and internationally, the before it began apparent coup attempt by Yevgeny Prigozhin in Russia, those two might seem like they exist on two totally different planes, never to intersect. But I think there might be a parallel. First of all, to deal with RTE, I think that far too little attention was paid to an anonymous article written in the Sunday Independent by someone that the Sindo editors assure us they know the identity of, and who is a senior Irish media and ad agency figure. It tells some very important details about how the advertising world works. I'm not going to go through the article, but in short, it relates to the Tubridy affair because Tubridy was paid out of a barter account that RTE maintained. The reason that account exists is because of, at the very least, a lack of transparency in the three-way deals whereby advertising agencies book advertising for big clients on RTE and possibly other broadcasters. The agency, theoretically, gets a 15% commission. So some big company has €1 million to spend on advertising. They pay that to the agency. The agency adds value by using their expertise to book the most effective ads for the client's target market. They pay RTE €850,000 for the ads, and they get to keep the difference. I'm not too sure about the maths there, but I'll let that go. But then, maybe at the end of the month or at the end of the year, RTE gives the agency a retrospective discount. Based on the volume of ads they bought from RTE, RTE give them back a percentage of the cash. Obviously, unless the agency pays that back to the advertisers whose money they were spending, that fattens up their commission very considerably. It seems that, in at least some cases, that's what happened. The anonymous writer in the Sindo says that this practice has been made illegal in places like the US, but not in Ireland. Depending on how the contracts were written, that could constitute a breach of contract or even criminal fraud, but since we don't have sight of the contracts, we don't know. But why was it made illegal in the US? Think of the incentives that this sets up. Firstly, if the agency is getting undeclared retrospective discounts from the broadcaster that they can just pocket as pure profit, then the advice of that advertising agency, their expertise that they're selling, should you buy ad space on RTE or on satellite channels, on Radio 1 or on Today FM, that advice could be hugely coloured by which broadcaster gives the agency the biggest retrospective discounts, rather than having that advice just being motivated by the best interests of the client. And what about the incentives for RTE? This system would create a huge temptation for them to set a very high headline price for their advertising in order to price in deep retrospective discounts that they could then refund to the advertising agencies. If those discounts are pure profit, that would motivate the agency to direct their clients to advertise with RTE. Advertising agencies are, of course, all private companies. Usually the management are the owners who will benefit from those increased profits. But RTE is state-owned, and in the general run of things, RTE making more profits doesn't normally make RTE management richer. So you'd hope that they were immune from such capitalist corruption. That's where the junkets come in. We've seen stories of various outlandish hospitality. Ostensibly, this is being paid for by advertising agencies, or by RTE, or out of those barter accounts. It's not really clear. But obviously, one way or another, it is being paid for by money coming from their clients, coming from the advertisers, whether those advertisers know it or not. You don't have to be a genius to work out that the junkets for RTE top staff are designed to keep this cosy arrangement going. It's their cut of the money that is being fleeced from commercial advertisers or from public service program making budgets, depending on which way you want to look at it. I look at it as a bit of both. Paying Tubridy cold hard cash out of the barter account might have been the most nakedly egregious example of this high living on someone else's dime. It's what brought attention to the whole gravy train, but it's a drop in the bucket. That anonymous writer estimated that €50 million or more flowed through that account. That's 150 times more than the cash that Tubridy got. But the day of reckoning for RTE fat cats is coming. This is not toothpaste that can be squeezed back into the tube. As for Yevgeny Prigozhin, he's gone into exile, supposedly, in Belarus, but there have been reports of him being cited in Russia. He was given amnesty, supposedly, by Putin, but reports are that he is still under investigation. Unbelievably, it actually seems that Prigozhin was telling the truth when he said that he wasn't trying to topple Putin. He was just trying to hold the wildly incompetent defense minister Sergei Shoigu and the chief of staff Valery Gerasimov to account.
Шойгу! Герасимов! Где боеприпасы? Посмотрите на них, сука! А теперь слушайте меня, сука,
Even without translation, you can't mistake the rage in Prigozhin's voice there when he was screaming foul-mouthed abuse at Shoigu and Gerasimov for denying him the ammunition he wants. In that video, he's literally surrounded by the corpses of his mercenaries. He's blaming Shoigu and Gerasimov for their deaths. It obviously doesn't strike him that he was the one who rounded them up from the prisons, gave them a couple of days training and the odd rusty old rifle, and used them as cannon fodder to attack well-armed, well-trained Ukrainian defenders. But it's not Prigozhin I'm interested in here. It's not Shoigu or Gerasimov. It's not even Putin. It's the reaction in those first few hours when it seemed like the march on Moscow could actually dislodge Putin. Firstly, when the mercenaries walked into Rostov-on-Don, the Russian city where the war against Ukraine is being run from, this was the reaction. People came out on the streets and cheered them. The crowds weren't huge, but they were totally spontaneous. Secondly, the mercenaries walked into Rostov-on-Don, the Russian city where the war against Ukraine is being run from. They didn't have to fire a single shot over what should be the most secure location in the country, and they didn't have a shot fired at them. During the few hours when a coup looked likely, there were reports of various army groups declaring their loyalty to Wagner. There is no evidence that a single soldier took up arms against him. That suggests that there is a lot of popular support within the army and the population for Prigozhin, or at least a lot of popular support for any vessel into which they can pour their dissatisfaction with Putin's regime. That tells us of an incredibly unstable situation within Russia, both in the general population and, as a result, within the elites that rule the place, particularly the people high enough up to give Putin a taste of his own tea. The exposure of that instability makes things even more unstable. It lets everyone know that there is little point in being loyal to the current regime because it's unlikely to be around long enough to repay that loyalty. And before I give anyone out there any hope of a democratic Russia, remember that those cheering Prigozhin are cheering him because they think Putin is not attacking hard enough, because he's too humanitarian, because he isn't killing enough Ukrainians for their liking. They think that Prigozhin could do a better job at genocide. But was it a 7-day or even 7-hour wonder? No. We don't know what's going to happen. Nobody does. But we know something is going to happen. This can't last. The Jenga tower might survive having another brick or two being removed from it, or it might come tumbling down when somebody upstairs slams a door. But whatever it is that's the immediate trigger, this whole thing is going to collapse very soon. And that's the connection with RTE. I spoke to a couple of people in RTE, mid-level staff, people who were well paid but not on crazy money. And the one thing that was noticeable was that they were the only people more furious than Yevgeny Prigozhin in the past couple of weeks. It hasn't passed their notice that politicians who normally run a mile from any criticism of RTE, and even if they did say anything critical, they would drown it in so much sycophancy that it was barely noticeable. Those politicians are now using words like disgraceful and outrageous about RTE without any qualification. And the reason that they're doing that is that we don't know what's coming down the line, but we know something is coming and we know it ain't good. The rest of that 50 million sloshing through RTE's barter account, you can bet your life it wasn't spent on widows and orphans. RTE's unaccountable mixing of the license fee, advertising income, and wads of cash thrown at it by the government has long been unjustifiable. The reality is that now any increase in the license fee to match inflation, or any more direct exchequer funding, is politically impossible. The current situation is unsustainable. The uncertainty might mean we don't know what the end result will be, but we know what it won't be. In a minute, we'll have the interview, but first I want to say thanks to all of the patrons, especially Nigel O'Mahony, who signed up as a patron since the last podcast. I really appreciate everyone who donates on Patreon. We don't get a huge amount of money, but we're not complaining. We use that money to pay the bills for the podcast, web hosting and so on, and Kevin and myself essentially give our time for free. But it's a great morale booster to get a new patron, so thanks to Nigel. That lets us know that there are people out there listening and appreciating the podcast. We make a big effort to cover things that are undercovered in Irish media. You're more than welcome to listen for free, but if you think that you could do the same as Nigel and the other donors and throw us the price of a cup of coffee once or twice a month, there's details how to do that on the website and at the end of the show.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? Follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter and like Here's How on Facebook for updates on each show's contents.
On the line, I have Uki Gonyi. He is a writer. He was born in the United States, but he's not an American citizen because he was born to an Argentinian diplomat in the United States, an ambassador to the US, and grew up for some of his childhood there and then moved, of all places, to Ireland and spent some of his teenage years in Ireland, which maybe explains some of your accent, Uki. But just very briefly, first of all, you've written a lot about the flight of Nazis after the war to Argentina. For people who don't know much about that other than, cliches that show up on The Simpsons or whatever, was that a major thing? Like, how many Nazis went to Argentina? Was it something that had a big impact on Argentinian society?
Well, it depends on how you define a Nazi. If you define a Nazi as former members of the SS or former members of the Nazi Party who ended up in Argentina, we're talking thousands. And then, of course, you have to include all the collaborators, from Croatia, France, Belgium. So we're talking tens of thousands likely.
Wow. And did they impact Argentina? Did they just kind of quietly live on rural farms, or did they have an impact on Argentinian society?
Well, there's this mythology that the Nazis who came to South America, they lived, far away on a hill in the Andes Mountains range or somewhere in the jungles of Brazil. But actually, they were living in downtown addresses, in upmarket addresses here in Buenos Aires. A large number of them went to work for the Argentine intelligence service, and they did have an influence in the sense that, if you're growing up and you have a little old German, who's living next door, as I did, and they did something terrible during the war, but you don't know exactly what, you get what I call this, slow getting used to the presence of evil in society. And that, I think, had an influence and made Argentina receptive to the crimes of the dictatorship in the 1970s, where some 30,000 people were made to disappear.
Okay. And then, as I said, as a teenager, you had the fortune or misfortune to arrive in Ireland, and you did your Leaving Cert, I think, in Ireland, and started university in Ireland. And tell me about your French teacher.
Okay. When I arrived in Dublin at the age of 14 from the United States, and I went to a school called St. Conleth's there on Clyde Road in Ballsbridge. And to my surprise, because of course I had grown up in the United States and was born in the United States, and I was surrounded by fathers of friends of mine who had fought in the Second World War against Nazis, and to my surprise, the French teacher at St. Conleth's was a former SS war criminal. He was condemned to death in France, and he had escaped to Ireland, and he was given employment at St. Conleth's. He was there for about 3 decades, and I had him for, the years I was at St. Conleth's. And he was a despicable...
Was he living openly?
Oh, quite, yes. As a matter of fact, I was told straight away, this is our French teacher, and he's a wanted war criminal in France, and he can't go back to France. And he would hand out pictures of himself in his SS uniform, and it was passed around, with the intention of the pupils passing it around the class. And he talked about it openly. He talked about how he couldn't go back to France, and the headmaster knew about it. So much so that I went home and I told my mother, I said, look, not only is there corporal punishment because there were, the strap and, and hitting us, and, corporal punishment that went on in Dublin in the 1970s in Ireland, which was totally unbelievable in the United States. And I said, but we have a teacher who's a Nazi. So my mother went to see the headmaster, a man called Kevin Kelleher. And she said, apart from the fact that you're beating my child, what's with the Nazi who's teaching here? And she was just, my mother got home and I said, what happened? And about the Nazi in particular, I was interested. And she said, well, the headmaster didn't seem to get it. And he stayed on, and even today in school literature, he's referred to as, a stern but an excellent French teacher, and he's kind of a legend. And so I gave a talk in Dublin in May, and I've written a letter to St. Conleth's, and I've asked them to please offer a public apology, the fact that they hired this SS officer for 3 decades, and the school is considering it.
And how did he treat the pupils and yourself?
Awfully. I mean, he was always smoking a Gauloise cigarette, kind of dangling on his lower lip, and he would flick the lit cigarette in your face. He had the thing that he did. Then he'd hit you with a ruler. He'd slap you across the face, kick you. And then there was a little game he had that you had to stand up in front of the class and name every single piece of clothing that you had on in French. And anything you didn't know the word for in French, you had to take off. So if you knew the word for everything, but you didn't know the word for underpants, you had to take off everything, take off your underpants, and put everything back on. So you were left in a situation where you're practically taking your clothes off in front of, a class of 20, 40 people. And incredibly, this went on until 1985 or 86 when he retired. So I think St. Columnus definitely owes us an apology, not only for subjecting us to an SS criminal as our French teacher, but to the violence and, just the corporal punishment of which he was the worst example in St. Columnus, and there were many.
And after that charming experience in Ireland, you went, I was talking before we started recording, I said you went home. In fact, you obviously knew about Argentina, but you hadn't lived in Argentina before then. You went to Argentina as your home country, even though you hadn't lived there. And what was the political situation when you arrived?
Well, the situation was there was a democratically elected government in Argentina when I arrived in 1975, and what I saw was this slow disintegration of society, where the construction of an imaginary enemy, and this the dissolution of truth, and just how people started inhabiting this delusional enemy world, imaginary enemy, and I saw how that was preceded, the military coup that brought authoritarianism in, and how that led to the mass killing that followed afterwards. Nazi-style death camps were set up all over Argentina, and people started what we called here disappearing. Some 30,000 in all.
To take the euphemism off from that, disappearing people, essentially meaning that they were kidnapped by the security forces of the dictatorship and then murdered, possibly tortured and then murdered, and their bodies disposed of in some secret way, and that never being acknowledged. 30,000 people, even in a country that's kind of relatively large like Argentina, is a huge proportion of the population. And the thing that I'm really interested in, because people have talked about this, is I think people have a good understanding of, a totalitarian dictatorship. People have a good understanding of democracy. But the steps to go from democracy to totalitarianism is something that I think a lot of people, including myself, don't have a full understanding of. If you were, maybe to be devil's advocate, if you were an aspiring dictatorship, what are the steps you take in order to eliminate democracy, as was done in Argentina, at least?
Well, there's like 2 or 3 steps. The first one is you attack the press, and you attack the concept of truth. You say that all truth is relative, that truth is a construction, and that there's no way that there could ever be an objective press, that all reporting must be subjective and is colored by the political preferences of the writer or the journalist. So first you attack that concept, then you attack the judicial system, and then you start creating situations of violence, low-level violence, to get the population used to the fact that violence is occurring, and you invent an imaginary enemy against whom to direct this violence.
Who was the enemy in Argentina?
In Argentina, it was, well, the military dictatorship. When they came in, they said they were going to protect Argentina. They were going to defend Argentina's Western and Christian way of life. And so they were basically against communism. Mm-hmm. And so there were some guerrilla groups in Argentina, not very numerous and not very powerful. So they blew up these small guerrilla groups into a threat that Argentina could somehow be turned into a communist socialist state like Cuba. They said that these guerrilla groups in Argentina was running the risk of the government being overthrown, and that Cuban-style, dictatorship would be imposed in Argentina. So the military stepped in when they came in and they explained their coup. They said, this is why we're doing it, because we want to stop the guerrilla groups from taking over Argentina. Now, the truth is, these guerrilla groups were, tiny. I mean, they never captured, they never held even a single city block for more than half an hour. Mm-hmm. And even not that, So, and maybe they killed about 600 people. These guerrilla groups killed about 600 people.
Mm-hmm.
So the number of guerrillas who were actually involved in killing people were maybe 200 or 300.
Mm-hmm.
So you're wondering, so all the other 30,000 people who were made to disappear, who were they?
Yeah.
And basically they were anybody, psychologists, psychoanalysts, journalists, writers, intellectuals, activists, people who went to the poorer districts to help out poor people. All of those were targeted as being anti-Christian and anti-Western, and therefore they deserve to die.
We have in Ireland some, fringe groups of people who make wild claims about threats to society, and they are usually of marginal credibility at the very most. Obviously, the Cuban Revolution had happened about 15 years beforehand, before this happened. And also, it was in the, Spanish-speaking Latin American sphere. So probably it was culturally closer to Argentina. But I'm just wondering, how do you make that credible? How do you need a control of the press or a section of the press in order to hype up the danger? Do you need some other form of cooperation, or is that, can it be created ab initio?
Control of the press, as I said, was the most important. The first thing you have to control is the press, to stop them reporting and to stop them, to get them on your side, to build up this imaginary threat of the imaginary enemy. In the case of the Nazis, it was, a cabal of secret Jewish leaders who ran the world in secret behind closed doors. In Argentina, it was a guerrilla group that was going to take over Argentina. And there was never any danger of that at all. But the military were obsessed, and when you look at the nationalist thinking in Argentina and the speeches of Franco, we were deeply influenced by the dictator Franco in Spain, who ruled Spain from 1936 to 1975. And Franco was obsessed with the French Revolution. He in his speeches during the Second World War, he said that the Nazis were unknowingly were providing a service to Christianity by undoing the evil and pernicious effects of the French Revolution, which basically for them was the separation of church and state. They wanted to return Argentina, and in the case of Franco, Spain, to a medieval kind of political system where the church reigned together, with the nobility and an anointed king-like figure. And that's what they definitely wanted to bring back in Argentina, with a large dose of anti-Semitism in there. Communism, and anti-Semitic publications is often equated with Jews, and so there was when they said communist, they were also meaning Jewish. Mm-hmm. So there was the large proportionally the number of Jews who were made to disappear was much larger than their proportional segment of the population.
You mentioned the support of the press. Was there a degree of popular support for this takeover?
Yes, there was. And this is the thing I've been writing. I wrote an essay for the New York Review of Books not so long ago, and 4 or 5 years ago. Because when I've been giving talks in the United States, like the lecture I gave in Dublin 2 months ago, I've been giving talks in the United States. And when you get up and talk about Nazis, the question from the audience in the United States is always, do you see a relationship with what happened in Germany in the 1930s and what's happening in the United States today? Mm-hmm. And yes, I definitely see one, because it's a standard textbook playbook that it's happening in the United States. Somebody like Trump first attracts the press, then they've gone for the judiciary. They're getting the Supreme Court to pass these undoing all the civil rights advancements of the 1960s and 1970s. So when when I arrived in Argentina, I started working for a small English language newspaper, the newspaper for the British community and the Irish community, which was quite large here, called the Buenos Aires Herald, and there was mostly British and Americans there, and we often wondered, if this slide into authoritarianism and into genocidal mass killings that we were seeing in Argentina, we asked ourselves, could this ever happen in the United States? Could this ever happen, again in Europe? And I had never thought that I would. I thought that this question was merely rhetorical, that I would never have to answer it in my own lifetime. And so, after studying it, because my first book was about the dictatorship, and I spent a long time writing, and I've been a witness in the human rights trials in Argentina here against perpetrators. And then I started studying, the escape of Nazis to Argentina. But I had never expected to face this in my own lifetime. And now I am, and I'm seriously worried about it. Because for me, when I see things, when I see, Nazi flags, marching down Charlottesville or what, and I'm thinking, well, in the United States, they think that democracy will save them. And no, democracy will not save you. You will have to save democracy, because basically democracy is defenseless against these authoritarian types who are willing to lie and willing to control the judiciary and to lie through their teeth and have no respect for the law at all. So you're left in a situation of, almost defenselessness against that.
There are various countries which are thought to be at risk of sliding into either dictatorship or into totalitarianism. I think Russia could not be argued as anything other than a dictatorship, but there's been certainly a turn in the degree of personal freedoms that have been eliminated in the past couple of years. People have also mentioned Poland, where the judiciary have been significantly undermined. Hungary, where not only the judiciary but also the press have been very significantly undermined, and the democratic process. And the US. If you were to look across all of those, which country would you say is in greatest danger?
Well, rather than say which country is in the greatest danger, which country would be able to inflict the greatest amount of danger on the world? The United States, of course, because the United States is so powerful. And you really have to worry about what's happening in the United States, and because you get the feeling that even though Americans are very aware of what's happening, I think there's something that you can only learn actually living under a dictatorship and living into the slide, and that slow slide into a dictatorship. Mm-hmm. But the slide is slow, but by slow I mean a few months. When I arrived in 75, in Argentina in April 75, and the coup was in March 76. I was here less than a year by the time when the coup happened. So I saw the normalization of violence and the normalization of the demonization of youth and of socialist or social concern was enough to brand you a communist and justify you being disappeared. Mm. So the change happens overnight. The buildup can be slow, but by slow I mean under a year, and then the change happens overnight. And as working on the Nazis, I've also interviewed a large number of Holocaust survivors, and they unanimously say this to me. There was, for example, a woman I interviewed from Hungary. Mm-hmm. And she said she was a schoolgirl when the Nazis arrived. And she said, from one day to the next, I went out on the street and my friends from school started pointing at me and saying, Jew, Jew, to the Nazis who, the Nazi troops who were walking on the street, and they would single me out as Jewish. And she said, I didn't understand it. How could it be, this person was sitting next to me, on the school bench, and she was my friend a day ago, and now she's pointing at me and saying, basically condemning me to death in front of the Nazis. So yes, you have to be extremely worried, in the United States, where the Supreme Court has said, you can deny service to somebody if they're gay, but and there's lots of blacks saying, well, couldn't by the same token, couldn't you deny service to somebody who's black, saying that your religion prohibits you from serving people who are black? So yes, the United States is very worrying situation right there.
There's two ways of looking at the endurance of democracy. One is that, flaws and all, American democracy has endured for almost 250 years. And you could say on that basis, you might expect it to endure, whatever the hiccups, you might expect it to endure for another 250. Or you could say, well, that's Gambler's fallacy, that just because something has been happening regularly up to now doesn't mean it's going to continue indefinitely into the future. Which of those two theories would you prefer?
I think that no matter how long it's lasted, it can change overnight. It's because it can change overnight. I mean, literally. For example, when I arrived in Argentina, we didn't know what was happening. When I was working at the newspaper, these mothers would arrive, and who to me, I was 23 at the time. To me, they seemed incredibly old, but they were in their late 40s probably. And they would say to me, well, last night these plainclothes men arrived, and they dragged my son out of the bed, and he's gone, and we don't know where they've taken him. And the next day they came and they took the television set and the refrigerator and the doors. I mean, literally, they said the doors. And it took us a good long while. It took us about a year till we figured out that, at that time we thought, well, they've taken these people, and, at the Herald, we were fighting, asking the dictatorship to say, well, tell us where you've taken these people and put them in proper jails, and tell the relatives where they're gone, where you've taken them. And it took us about a year till we realized, actually, they haven't taken them anywhere. They've killed them. Shortly after they took them, they've killed them. And And there's something there, because it was difficult for us to imagine how could these military men, because this hadn't happened before in Argentina. There'd been lots of military dictatorships, but they were relatively benign ones. There'd never been any kind of mass killing of this kind before. So it was difficult for us to imagine. I said, how could this be? Because I grew up in a family of Argentine diplomats, so I knew lots of these generals and lots of military people. And the idea that any of them could have been in any way involved in this kind of mass killing was, unbelievable to us. So no matter how unbelievable it is actually true, because these people who actually, they whip themselves up into this kind of mystic, religious, political fervor that they decide, well, these young people with their idea of free love and equality and their socialist ideas, they're just the antechamber to communism. So we've got to kill them because, if not, they're endangering our Christian and Occidental way of life. And they do whip themselves up into that frenzy in secret. And then one day when they achieve power, they let that monster out of the cage. And suddenly you have 10,000 people dead, or 20,000 or 30,000 as in Argentina. So yes, it happens overnight.
I'm wondering about what else goes on in society as tens of thousands of people are being arrested in the night and spirited away and murdered. Do people still buy bread at the bakery? Do people walk their dog? Is there a different feeling in society, or is it possible that to just get on with your life for the most part?
That is exactly so. I mean, life goes on. Life goes on. And I saw this when the mothers came to report that the son had been taken. Sometimes they arrived dragging their husbands with them. And the husbands were extremely reticent to come to the Herald to tell us what had happened. And while the mother was there telling me about, the kidnapping of the son, the husband would be saying, "Hush, shut up. You're putting us all in danger. They've taken one kid. They're going to take the next one now. So if you keep, don't speak to this journalist." I'd see these kind of matrimonial fights in front of me. And so the husband would say, and plus if it gets out that our son was kidnapped, I'd lose my job immediately because of the stigma attached to having a missing person in your family in Argentina at that time. So out of fear, you would just fire, an employee if they had a missing son. So yeah, life goes on, and even if you have somebody missing in your own family, there's the day-to-day stuff that just, you have to keep paying your bills, you have to hang on to your job, and like the husband said in front of me, well, they took one kid, let's not put our other kids at risk by reporting, this kidnapping to this newspaper. The wives usually won this fight. Yeah, it's life goes on, and this is the incredible thing. I still went out every, most nights, once a week or twice a week, I'd go to a discotheque. I was in my early 20s. I'd get together with friends and go to see movies. I remember going to see Apocalypse Now, around that time. And Close Encounters of the First Kind, and E.T., those films that were coming out in the early 80s. So life goes on. You're still saying, what movie are we going to go see tonight? And for example, I remember when I got back from the Herald, I'd meet with friends and I'd tell them, look, this woman arrived at the Herald today. She said they took her son away in the middle of the night, and then they came and took the TV set the next day. And my friends would just look away and then not comment on anything that I'd said. And then they say, well, what movie do you want to go see tonight? So I very, very quickly learned that there's this silence that's imposed, not from above, but, that's kind of, you instinctively know to keep quiet about this, because if not, you run the risk of disappearing yourself. So everything is conspiring against you. There's this silence that even from people who do not agree with these kind of crimes and do not agree with the dictatorship, they keep silent as well. And I often say the problem is not so much the bad guys, the problem is the good guys who create this wall of silence around them.
I'm interested in the distinction between totalitarianism and dictatorship. And from what you say there, obviously there was a newspaper being run that was obviously not entirely sympathetic to the government. So there was a degree of independent press, even as people were being rounded up and murdered. And there is, I think, a distinction between two different types of regime. And Hitler's Nazi regime in Germany was something that I think almost instantly, not quite instantly, but almost instantly went to totalitarianism. So even the slightest criticism of the regime would have most likely led to your death. That wasn't the case, for example, in Italy. So Mussolini came to power in 1922 in Italy, although they had his fascist party had some power before then, but he essentially became dictator in 1922. But he literally almost fell out of power. So great was the scandal when a socialist MP, Giacomo Mattateo, was kidnapped and murdered by his thugs, essentially. And that did very nearly knock him out of power. And you could also maybe make the contrast between up to a couple of years ago in Russia, whereby clearly it was not a democracy, but people could complain fairly openly, and it might not be terribly good for their career, but it would not be necessarily terribly dangerous. Did you experience that change from dictatorship to totalitarianism, or did that happen in Argentina? That's a long pause.
Yeah, yeah. I don't make that distinction so much. I think it's
It may be a spectrum rather than a distinction.
yes, it's like saying, would you prefer to be killed by a piano falling on your head, or would you prefer to be killed by being tickled to death? The end result is the same. You end up dying. So I think, whether a dictatorship becomes absolutely totalitarian or not, in the sense that it controls every aspect of your life. For example, the closing of borders so you can't travel. That didn't happen in Argentina, except for some people, of course, who were the targets of the repression, and of course they couldn't travel anywhere. So it's still just as evil, and it's still just as traumatic, for the whole of society, I think. So yes, of course, there were, there's absolutely totalitarian regimes like the Soviet Union, where you could not leave the Soviet Union at all, for decades. And then, regimes like the one in Argentina that only lasted, 7 or 8 years, and where most people were allowed to travel freely. As regards the press, just the fact that the Herald existed doesn't mean that there was other press reporting this. We were the only newspaper reporting on this in Argentina. The press went completely silent, and it was just not the press. The church went completely silent. Other religious groups went completely silent. Politicians went completely silent. So, except for the Herald, and just because we were run by this very brave British editor called Robert Cox, who decided that he would take on the dictatorship on this on the fact that they were kidnapping people. We were the only voice in the wilderness. So the press very quickly fell into line, and that's my big fear regarding the United States and the move to authoritarianism in Europe as well, is that the press is brave, and then suddenly one day it goes silent, and then you are left, without information at all. And the day of social media, when billionaires are controlling social media, and some of these billionaires have totalitarian sympathies, you really wonder where you're going to get your information from. Because the biggest danger is not a completely totalitarian regime. The biggest danger is a democracy, a totalitarian regime where there are still elections, where you still have a semblance of a working democracy, as in some countries in Europe today. Hungary is a case in point. Those
you have
are
a theatre of
aspects.
democracy, essentially.
Yes, and so because an authoritarian, a dictator of the 21st century will have learned the lesson that, you don't actually need to ban elections, and you don't actually need to close Congress, and you don't actually need to close all the newspapers. You can just control them and have a semblance of democracy, and that will mean that you keep on getting loans, you keep on getting to be a part of the EU, and it has all these advantages. And as long as you control the press and you control the judicial system, you can get away with it. And that's the biggest danger, and I think the biggest difference between 20th century totalitarianism and what we're seeing, the 21st century version of it that we're living through now.
I don't know how much Irish history you did for your leaving cert, but for me, and I might be in a minority of one, but I think that the most pivotal day in Irish history, in the history of the independent state, was the 9th of March 1933, and that was the day, not of the election, but the day that Fianna Fáil actually went into the Dáil, and Eamon de Valera was elected Taoiseach after 10 years of a Cumann Gael government following independence and following Sinn Féin and later Fianna Fáil boycotting and abstaining from the Dáil. 1933, the 1930s in general, were not exactly a great time for democracy. And the other countries that came to democracy at the start of the 20th century, like Greece or Portugal and Spain, democracy in all of them failed. And the result of that was catastrophic, and it essentially destroyed the rest of the 20th century in large part for those countries. And at that time, on that day, Cumann na Gael could easily have organised a coup and could easily rhetorically have justified it by saying that these are gunmen who reject the authority of the state, and they still had control of the army and the Gardaí at the time that they walked into the Dáil. And it is reputed, I think it's fairly well established, that many Fianna Fáil deputies who were going into Leinster House for more or less the first time had revolvers in their pockets because they anticipated there was a good chance that they were going to be arrested and potentially shot or whatever in order to have a coup to prevent them from taking power. And what happened was nothing. Nobody organised a coup. Nobody took any action against them, and Eamon de Valera was elected Taoiseach, and there was a peaceful transfer of power. That seems like, looking back on it, like the normal thing to do, but it wouldn't have surprised anybody in 1933 if the other scenario had happened. Do you think a lot of this is down to luck?
I think it's down, well, yeah, luck in a kind of social sense, in the sense of, how these tides of history, how the tide of history grabs you at a particular moment, but you can't really control them. So, you can't control those tides of history that sweep you one way or another. So in that sense, perhaps it is down to luck. But Ireland is a standout in all kinds of senses. And I have to say, my father was the Argentine ambassador in Ireland, for 5 years, and Eamon de Valera was a frequent guest at the receptions at home, and so was Senator Yates, who was the son of W.B. Yates, and I used to take a peek from the staircase to see these two great men that I admired from. Even as a teenager, I already had an interest in historical subjects. Ireland is a standout, and just the fact that how it's reached a consensus regarding Northern Ireland. When I grew up there in the late 60s and 1970s, early 70s, and the troubles in the north. I was there when they burnt down the British Embassy in 1972, and in Dublin, and just Ireland has this incredible history of walking through these very dangerous moments and coming out is shining democracy, with all its blemishes. And some people hearing me in Ireland will say, well, it's not shining, but
but actually it is. I'm going to preempt the people who are preempting you, because actually it is, and we are entirely correct to criticize the failings, and we are entirely correct to say where it could be improved. But the reality is, if you look at the World Democracy Index, which is an entirely objectively, you can argue with maybe some details of it, but less than 1/3 of 1% of the population of the earth live in countries that have a better quality democracy than Ireland. And that is, for all its flaws, that is an amazing achievement.
No, and it's built on compromise. The fact that Ireland wrote the incorporation of the North out of its constitution in order to reach an agreement regarding that. That's the kind of compromise that it would be unthinkable in most other countries. The Irish have grown very good at compromise and accepting, solutions that are not 100% perfect, but that are still a solution. And that's a hard sell in a country like Argentina, where people are far more passionate and far more idealistic and far more ideological. It's very difficult to sell something like that. And that's why I think Argentina had the kind of dictatorship we had, because there was a slow buildup, this intense hatred between, what you have to look out for is the polarization of a nation. That's not a tool to go to reach authoritarianism, but it's certainly indicative that you're heading towards authoritarianism. Argentina was heavily polarized between Peronists and anti-Peronists, like the United States is now polarized between Trump and anti-Trump. And Ireland has managed, despite being heavily polarized, they reached a compromise. For me, Ireland is a standout, and with few, as you mentioned, very few other countries in the world can brag that.
What does the future hold for Argentina?
Very difficult right now. We're having an inflation percent of by some estimates over 100% a year. The economy is really, really bad. Argentina was there were two countries in the Western Hemisphere that at the early 20th century that were destined to be the two greatest nations on earth, the United States and Argentina. Argentina was like the sixth richest nation in the world. There were more telephone lines here and more cars per inhabitant than in France, for example. And then something went incredibly wrong, and we ended up with this orgy of violence in the 1970s. It was a country, with free education up to university level, the lowest illiteracy rate in South America, and suddenly illiteracy is way up. Education, the public school system is practically collapsing. The public health is in disarray as well. So I don't know. It's heavily polarized, and we're seeing the comeback, of apologists of the dictatorship. Just like everywhere else, we're polarized here between people like me who say we can never go back to the kind of dictatorship that we had before, and it's wrong to kill people or kidnap people and torture them and then throw them alive out of airplanes into the Atlantic Ocean, which is how most people died. But now there's apologists and negationists in Congress and running for office. We have elections, presidential elections in October, and I'm scared of a Bolsonaro type figure or a Trump like figure, emerging in Argentina, either in these elections or in the near future.
Uki Gonyi, Argentinian historian and author with a special view of Ireland. Thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you, William.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show. And while you're there, you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter @Here's How Podcast, and follow Uki Gonyi @Uki Gonyi, spelling on the website. And get in touch if you want to suggest a guest or a topic for an upcoming show. Thanks again to all of the patrons on Patreon, especially Nigel O'Mahony. They cover the costs of keeping the podcast going with things like servers and phone bills and things like that. Kevin and myself essentially donate our time for free, but if you could throw in the price of a cup of coffee or even the price of a pint once or twice a month, please do go and sign up at patreon.com/here'show. That link is on the website. Also there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone or by email. All that information is at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. The co-producer is Kevin Wolf. Thank you for listening.